My name is Tom Wilson, and I'm about to tell you how I discovered that my teenage son was being systematically bullied by his own teacher, and how I used my unique position as a substitute teacher to expose her cruelty and end her career. I'm 48 years old, living in suburban Minneapolis, Minnesota. I work as a substitute teacher for the district, filling in at different schools when regular teachers are sick or need coverage. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills and gives me flexibility to be present for my family. My wife Karen works as a nurse at the local hospital, pulling long shifts to help support our household. We have two kids, Jessica, who's 22 and away at college, and Michael, who's 18 and a senior at Roosevelt High School. We're not wealthy by any means. We drive older cars, shop sales at the grocery store, and our biggest splurge is the family vacation to a cabin in northern Minnesota every summer. But we're happy, close-knit, and proud of the kids we've raised. Michael has always been a good student. Not a straight A superstar, but solid Bs and the occasional A in subjects he enjoys. He's quiet, thoughtful, and more interested in reading and computer programming than sports or popular social activities. He's never been one of the cool kids, but he's always seemed comfortable with who he is, until this year. When Michael started his senior year in September, something changed. He became withdrawn, anxious, and his grades started dropping dramatically. He'd come home from school quiet and tense, go straight to his room, and barely speak during family dinners. When Karen and I asked about school, he'd give vague answers about being tired or having too much homework. When we asked about specific classes, he'd deflect or change the subject. His grades were particularly bad in AP English, taught by Mrs. Catherine Brennan. Michael had always enjoyed English and been a strong writer, so his C average in that class was shocking. When we looked at his returned assignments, we saw harsh comments written in red ink that seemed unnecessarily critical and demoralizing. But what worried us most was Michael's demeanor. He'd developed nervous habits, biting his nails, fidgeting constantly, and what seemed like anxiety about going to school each morning. Some days he'd claim to feel sick and ask to stay home. Karen and I decided to schedule a parent-teacher conference with Mrs. Brennan to understand what was happening in her classroom and how we could support Michael's improvement. That meeting would reveal the beginning of a much darker situation than we'd imagined. Mrs. Catherine Brennan was in her early 40s, impeccably dressed, and had the authoritative demeanor of someone accustomed to being in control. She taught AP English and was considered one of the more demanding teachers at Roosevelt High. During our conference, Mrs. Brennan painted a picture of Michael that didn't match the son we knew. She described him as lazy, disrespectful, and intellectually inferior to his classmates. She claimed he disrupted class discussions, submitted poor quality work, and showed no motivation to improve. When I asked for specific examples, Mrs. Brennan pulled out Michael's portfolio and showed us essays with extensive red corrections and comments like shallow thinking, lacks intellectual depth, and not college material. But something felt wrong about her assessment. The writing samples looked like Michael's work, but the errors she'd marked seemed inconsistent with his actual abilities. Some of the corrections she'd made were actually incorrect themselves. When I politely pointed out that one of her grammar corrections was wrong, Mrs. Brennan's demeanor shifted. She became defensive and condescending, suggesting that parents who weren't education professionals shouldn't question classroom assessments. Karen asked about ways we could help Michael improve, and Mrs. Brennan responded that some students simply weren't suited for advanced coursework and that Michael might be happier in regular English classes. We left that meeting feeling frustrated and confused. The Michael we knew at home didn't match the student Mrs. Brennan described, but we couldn't understand why a teacher would deliberately misrepresent a student's performance. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to Michael's schoolwork and his reactions to different classes. His performance in other subjects was normal. He was doing well in math, science, and history. The problem seemed isolated to Mrs. Brennan's class. I also began asking subtle questions about his daily experiences. Michael remained reluctant to share details, but gradually I learned that Mrs. Brennan had a pattern of singling him out for criticism in front of other students. She'd call on him with difficult questions when she knew he wasn't prepared, then make comments about his lack of preparation to the entire class. She'd read portions of his essays aloud as examples of what not to do. She'd make subtle comments about students who don't belong in advanced classes. Michael was being systematically humiliated and psychologically bullied by his own teacher. But I needed to see this behavior firsthand before taking any action. As a substitute teacher with district access, I knew I might have an opportunity to observe Mrs. Brennan's classroom if the right situation arose. That opportunity came sooner than expected. In early November, I received a call from Roosevelt High's main office asking if I could cover for a teacher who'd called in sick. When I asked which class, they said it was a planning period coverage for Mrs. Brennan. I'd be monitoring her AP English class while she attended a mandatory faculty meeting. I accepted the assignment immediately. Mrs. Brennan's instructions were simple. Have the students work on their current essay assignments quietly while she was gone. She emphasized that this was an advanced class that required minimal supervision. When I arrived at her classroom, I was struck by the atmosphere. The students seemed tense and subdued in a way that was unusual for a high school classroom. There was none of the normal chatter or relaxed interaction I typically saw when covering other teachers' classes. Michael was shocked to see me walk in as a substitute. I gave him a subtle nod to indicate he should act normally, then announced to the class that they should continue working on their assignments as Mrs. Brennan had instructed. What I observed over the next 50 minutes was enlightening and disturbing. Even without Mrs. Brennan present, the students in her AP English class seemed afraid to speak normally or interact naturally. They worked in silence, occasionally whispering questions to each other, but immediately stopping if I looked in their direction. I walked around the classroom, ostensibly monitoring their work, but actually observing the environment Mrs. Brennan had created. What I found was systematic intimidation disguised as academic rigor. Posted prominently on the walls were examples of poor student work, with the authors' names clearly visible. I recognized one of Michael's essays among them, marked up with harsh red comments and displayed as an example of inadequate effort. Mrs. Brennan's grading rubric was posted near her desk, and it was clearly designed to be nearly impossible to satisfy. Requirements were vague and contradictory, making it easy to find fault with any student's work regardless of its actual quality. I also found a seating chart that placed students like Michael, quiet, less popular kids, in the front rows where they'd be easy targets for public questioning and criticism. But most disturbing was what I found in Mrs. Brennan's desk when I was looking for extra pencils for a student. There was a notebook labeled Student Observations that contained detailed notes about individual students' personalities, family backgrounds, and personal vulnerabilities. Michael's entry was particularly cruel. Mrs. Brennan's notes about Michael revealed the true scope of her psychological bullying. She'd written detailed observations about his quiet personality, his lack of participation in school social activities, and even comments about our family's economic status based on his clothes and supplies. More disturbing were her strategic notes about how to motivate certain students through targeted criticism. For Michael, she'd written, responds to public embarrassment, use essay examples to demonstrate inadequacy, parents are defensive, avoid direct confrontation. She had been deliberately targeting my son for psychological abuse, documenting her methods like a predator studying her prey. I photographed the relevant pages with my phone, being careful not to disturb anything else in her desk. This wasn't just poor teaching, it was calculated emotional abuse of minors. When the period ended and students were leaving, one girl approached me hesitantly. "Mr. Wilson," she said quietly, "are you Michael's dad?" When I confirmed that I was, she looked around to make sure no other students were listening, then said something that made my blood run cold. "Mrs. Brennan is really mean to him. She picks on him every day, and it's not fair. Some of us have tried to say something, but she just gets worse if she thinks we're defending each other." This confirmed that Michael's experience wasn't isolated or imaginary. Mrs. Brennan was systematically bullying him in front of his peers, and other students had noticed but felt powerless to intervene. That evening, I sat down with Michael and told him what I'd observed in his classroom. I explained that I needed his help to stop Mrs. Brennan from continuing to hurt him and potentially other students. Michael was initially reluctant to discuss details, worried that speaking up would make things worse. But when I assured him that I had evidence and a plan to address the situation properly, he opened up about months of daily humiliation and psychological abuse. Mrs. Brennan had been targeting him since the beginning of the school year. She'd single him out for criticism, make disparaging comments about his intelligence and potential, and use his work as negative examples in front of other students. She'd also made personal comments about his appearance, his family's economic status, and his social standing among classmates. She suggested that he wasn't college material and should consider more realistic post-graduation plans. Michael had been afraid to tell us because he worried we'd confront Mrs. Brennan directly and make the situation worse. He'd also been convinced by her psychological manipulation that maybe her criticisms were justified and he really wasn't smart enough for advanced classes. Working together, we developed a plan to document Mrs. Brennan's behavior and build a case that would protect Michael and other students from her abuse. Over the next 3 weeks, I arranged to substitute at Roosevelt High whenever possible, specifically requesting assignments that would put me in proximity to Mrs. Brennan's classroom. As a regular substitute, I had legitimate reasons to be in the building and access to areas where I could observe her interactions with students. I documented everything: her classroom environment, her teaching methods, her interactions with different students, and most importantly, her specific targeting of Michael and other vulnerable students. I also began building relationships with other parents whose children were struggling in Mrs. Brennan's class. Through casual conversations at school events and around the neighborhood, I learned that Michael wasn't her only victim. Several other families had noticed their children becoming anxious, withdrawn, or performing poorly, specifically in Mrs. Brennan's class. But like us, they had assumed it was just the stress of advanced coursework rather than systematic abuse. Most importantly, I started recording conversations with Michael about his daily experiences in class. With his permission, I documented specific incidents of humiliation and psychological manipulation that formed a clear pattern of deliberate targeting. I also researched Mrs. Brennan's background and discovered that she'd been moved between schools several times in her career, always with vague explanations about seeking new challenges or better fits with a school culture. The opportunity for decisive action came when Mrs. Brennan scheduled individual parent conferences to discuss mid-semester grades. She specifically requested meetings with parents of struggling students, including us. But I had a different plan for that meeting. Working with 2 other parents whose children were being similarly targeted, we coordinated our approach. I would attend the scheduled conference with Mrs. Brennan, but Karen would simultaneously be meeting with the school principal to file a formal complaint backed by extensive documentation. The other parents would file their own complaints the same day, creating a pattern that couldn't be dismissed as a single disgruntled family's grievance. On the day of the conference, I arrived at Mrs. Brennan's classroom with a hidden recording device and a detailed list of questions designed to get her to reveal her methods and motivations on tape. Mrs. Brennan began the meeting with her usual condescending assessment of Michael's performance, but this time I was prepared to challenge every false claim and manipulative statement. When she suggested that Michael wasn't intellectually capable of advanced coursework, I asked her to provide specific evidence to support that assessment. When she claimed he was disruptive and disrespectful, I asked for documented incidents and witnesses. When she insisted that his poor performance was due to lack of effort, I presented examples of other teachers' positive assessments of his work and character. Mrs. Brennan became increasingly defensive and eventually revealed the truth about her teaching philosophy and her specific targeting of certain students. As I continued to challenge Mrs. Brennan's assessments with specific questions and evidence, she became frustrated and began speaking more candidly about her approach to teaching. She explained that advanced classes required weeding out students who couldn't handle the rigor, and that sometimes this meant being brutally honest about students' limitations. When I asked why she focused so much negative attention on Michael specifically, she said that some students needed reality checks about their abilities and that it was better to crush false hopes early than let students fail later. Most damaging was her admission that she deliberately used certain students' work as negative examples because public embarrassment is a powerful motivator, and these kids need to understand their place. I had recorded everything, and Mrs. Brennan had essentially confessed to systematic psychological abuse disguised as educational methodology. When I asked her directly if she thought it was appropriate to humiliate students in front of their peers, she responded that coddling mediocre students doesn't prepare them for the real world. That statement would end her career. While I was recording Mrs. Brennan's confession, Karen was in the principal's office with documentation of months of psychological abuse, supported by testimony from multiple families and photographic evidence of the hostile classroom environment. The principal, Dr. Sarah Martinez, was initially skeptical that a veteran teacher would engage in such systematic targeting of students. But when presented with the evidence, Mrs. Brennan's personal notes about students, examples of inappropriate classroom displays, and testimony from multiple families, she couldn't ignore the pattern. When I arrived at Dr. Martinez's office with the recording of Mrs. Brennan's confession, the case became undeniable. We had documented evidence of deliberate psychological abuse, admission of targeting specific students for humiliation, and proof that she'd been using her position of authority to systematically damage children's self-esteem and academic confidence. Dr. Martinez immediately suspended Mrs. Brennan pending a full investigation and arranged for counseling support for affected students. But the consequences went beyond just Roosevelt High School. The district's investigation revealed that Mrs. Brennan's pattern of psychological abuse had been ongoing for years across multiple schools. Other families came forward with similar stories of targeted harassment, deliberate humiliation, and systematic destruction of students' academic confidence. The investigation also uncovered that previous complaints about Mrs. Brennan had been inadequately addressed, often dismissed as personality conflicts or academic disagreements, rather than recognized as professional misconduct. Mrs. Brennan was terminated immediately, and her teaching license was revoked by the State Board of Education. She would never be allowed to teach in any public school system again. More importantly, the district implemented new policies for monitoring classroom environments, responding to student and parent complaints, and providing support for students who'd been psychologically damaged by abusive teaching practices. Michael's recovery from Mrs. Brennan's psychological abuse took time, But with counseling support and a new English teacher who recognized his actual abilities, he began to regain his confidence in academic performance. His new teacher, Mr. James Park, reviewed Michael's work history and immediately recognized that his struggles had been artificially created by an abusive environment rather than any lack of ability or effort. Within 2 months of Mrs. Brennan's removal, Michael's grades improved dramatically. More importantly, he began to enjoy school again and regained interest in activities and subjects that Mrs. Brennan had convinced him he wasn't good at. Several other students showed similar improvement once they were removed from Mrs. Brennan's toxic influence. The psychological damage she'd inflicted was real, but it was also reversible with proper support and encouragement. The exposure of Mrs. Brennan's systematic abuse led to broader changes in how the district handles complaints about teacher misconduct and monitors classroom environments for signs of psychological abuse. New policies require regular classroom observations by multiple administrators, anonymous feedback systems for students to report concerns, and mandatory training for all staff on recognizing and preventing psychological abuse in educational settings. The district also implemented support systems for students who've experienced educational trauma, including counseling services and academic support to help them rebuild their confidence and skills. Most importantly, other teachers in the district learned that systematic psychological abuse would not be tolerated or overlooked, regardless of a teacher's seniority or academic reputation. Mrs. Brennan attempted to appeal her termination and license revocation, claiming that her methods were simply demanding academic standards rather than abuse. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her appeals were denied at every level. She eventually moved out of state, and as far as we know, is no longer working in education. The permanent revocation of her teaching license ensures that she cannot easily obtain employment in schools anywhere in the country. Michael completed his senior year with renewed confidence and strong grades across all subjects. He's now attending college and pursuing his interests in computer science and creative writing, subjects that Mrs. Brennan had convinced him he wasn't capable of succeeding in. Karen and I learned valuable lessons about advocating for our children and recognizing signs of institutional abuse. We also developed stronger relationships with other parents, school administrators who are committed to protecting students from predatory teachers. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about destroying Mrs. Brennan's career. The answer is absolutely not. She chose to use her position of authority to psychologically abuse children for years. When she was finally held accountable for those choices, it was justice, not persecution. The real tragedy would have been allowing her to continue damaging young people's lives because confronting her seemed too difficult or risky. As a substitute teacher, I had unique access and understanding of school environments that allowed me to document Mrs. Brennan's abuse effectively. But any parent who pays attention to their child's emotional well-being and school experience can recognize signs of educational trauma and take appropriate action. The most important lesson from this experience is that systematic abuse in schools can only continue when it's hidden from scrutiny. When parents work together to document problems and demand accountability, even entrenched abusers can be stopped. You don't need wealth, connections, or special expertise to protect your children from institutional abuse. You just need to pay attention, document everything, and refuse to accept explanations that don't match your observations. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply exposing the truth and letting natural consequences unfold. Mrs. Brennan destroyed her own career through her choices. I just made sure those choices were properly documented and reported. And sometimes justice isn't about getting even. It's about making sure that abusers can't continue harming other people's children. That's how an ordinary substitute teacher brought down a predatory educator who thought her position made her untouchable.